Hello, and welcome back to Tangents on Cracked Spines, and I appreciate you. If you're new, I would suggest going back at least 2 episodes to get the beginning of the story. As always, listener discretion is advised, as there are adult themes. We are currently reading H.G. Wells' The Invisible Man. And we last left off with the stranger, who 5 chapters in is not named, being at this inn for several months now. He's made everybody both highly suspicious of himself and hate him. Like, there's nobody in town that actually likes the man, because he is a rather gruff individual. There's lots of rumors about him. Some say he's an escaped criminal. Some people say that he's hiding the fact that he is multiple colors. There's a name for that in modern medical terms that begins with a V, and I cannot remember the name of that. There's my cat destroying things. And, oh yes, the big thing that we ended with, other than the fact that he had lots and lots of luggage in the town, of course that also got the townspeople talking, is that someone broke into the vicar's house. And the vicar was there, but nobody could see who broke into the house. And the only thing that makes me go, oh my gosh, is picturing the fact that this guy had to have been completely naked. Could you imagine, like, early spring in, like, in England, running around buck-ass naked just to steal something? Anyways, that's where we left off, was the vicar looking at his wife and being like, somebody was here and stole stuff, right? We heard them sneezing, we heard them running around, they lit the candle. We saw the door open and close by itself. Were we just robbed by a ghost? I digress, as always. Anyways, let us begin. Chapter 6. It's a good thing I can read Roman numerals. The future that went... I'm starting off real strong. The furniture that went mad. Now it happened that in the early hours of Whit Monday, before Millie was hunted for the day... Alright. Mr. Hall and Mrs. Hall both rose and went noiselessly down into the cellar. Their business there was of a private nature, and had something to do with the specific gravity of their beer. They had hardly entered the cellar when Mrs. Hall found she had forgotten to bring down a bottle of sarsaparilla from their joint room. As she was the expert and principal operator of this affair, Hall very properly went upstairs for it. On the landing, he was surprised to see that the stranger's door was ajar. Oh yeah, that's the other thing. There are about 3 people who are pretty sure that they have seen the invisible man be invisible. But they're chucking it up to being nuts. Or misseeing things. Including the doctor, who was actually touched by the invisible hand and ran down to the vicar before the vicar got robbed. The vicar laughed at him. He went on into his own room and found the bottle as he had been directed. But returning with the bottle, he noticed that the bolts of the front door had been shot back, and the door was in fact simply on the latch. And with a flash of inspiration, he connected this with the stranger's room upstairs and the suggestions of Mr. Teddy Henfrey. He distinctly remembered holding the candle while Mrs. Hall shot these bolts overnight. At the sight, he stopped, gaping, when, with the bottle still in his hand, went upstairs again. He rapped at the stranger's door. There was no answer. He rapped again, then pushed the door wide open and entered. It was as he expected. The bed, the room also, was empty. And what was stranger, even to his heavy intelligence, on the bedroom chair and along the rail of the bed were scattered the garments, the only garments so far as he knew, and the bandages of their guest. His big slouch hat, even, was cocked jauntily over the bedpost. As Hall stood there, he heard his wife's voice coming out of the depths of the cellar, with that rapid telescoping of the syllables and interrogative cocking up of the final words to a high note, by which the West Sussex villager is wont to indicate a brisk impatience. "George, you get what I want!" All right. At that, he turned and hurried down to her. "Janny," he said over the rail of the cellar steps, "'tis the truth what Henfrey says. He's not in you's room, aunt. And the front door's unbolted." At first, Mrs. Hall did not understand, and as soon as she did, she resolved to see the empty room for herself. Hall, still holding the bottle, went first. "If he ain't there," he said, "his clothes are, and what's he doing without his clothes then? 'Tis a most curious business." As they came up the cellar steps, they both, it was afterwards ascertained, fancied they heard the front door open and shut, but seeing it closed and nothing there, neither said a word to the other about it at the time. Mrs. Hall passed her husband in the passage and ran on first upstairs. Someone sneezed on the staircase. Hall, following 6 steps behind, thought that he heard her sneeze. She, going on first, was under the impression that Hall was sneezing. She flung open the door and stood regarding the room. "Of all the curious," she said. She heard a sniff close behind her head, as it seemed, and turning, was surprised to see Hall a dozen feet off on the topmost stair. But in another moment he was beside her. She bent forward and put her hand on the pillow and then under the clothes. "Cold," she said. "He's been up this hour or more." As she did so, a most extraordinary thing happened. The bedclothes gathered themselves together, leapt up suddenly into a sort of peak, and then jumped headlong over the bottom rail. It was exactly as if a hand had clutched them in the center and flung them aside. Immediately after, the stranger's hat hopped off the bedpost, described a whirling flight in the air through the better part of a circle, and then dashed straight at Mrs. Hall's face. Then, as swiftly as the sponge from the washstand, and then the chair, flinging the stranger's coat and trousers carelessly aside, and laughing dryly in a voice singularly like the stranger's, turned itself up with its 4 legs at Mrs. Hall, seemed to take aim at her for a moment, and charged at her. She screamed and turned, and then the chair legs came gently but firmly against her back and impelled her and Hall out of the room. The door slammed violently and was locked. The chair and bed seemed to be executing a dance of triumph for a moment, and then abruptly everything was still. Okay, I will confess I've never actually seen a movie about the Invisible Man, but I guarantee that scene is not in it, and it should be. If I'm wrong, please tell me and tell me which version I need to watch, because that would be a hilarious cinematic scene, as would be, any of the others thus far. This is a hilarious story. Also, like, if you're gonna steal from somebody buck-ass naked, maybe don't do it while you have a cold. Because I think that's also a hilarious thing is, they keep it showing that they're looking around for him because he is sneezing or sniffling. It's in, like, those scenes in a lot of movies where, like, somebody's hiding behind the curtain and they're getting away with it until, like, there's some dust or something and they sneeze and they go, aha! That's where the person is. Except you can't see this person. So they're like, what the hell, did it go sneeze? Is my is my in bed attacking me? Mrs. Hall was left almost in a fainting condition in Mr. Hall's arms on the landing. It was with the greatest difficulty that Mr. Hall and Millie, who had been roused by her scream of alarm, succeeded in getting her downstairs and applying the restoratives customary in these cases. Pretty sure that means alcohol. Or at least spiked tea. And also, I kind of like the fact that they're like, yeah, Mr. Hall can't carry his own wife when she's fainted. He needs help. So either he's weak or she's a larger woman. The way everything is spelled, I know it's supposed to be, old country bumpkin English person, but it immediately makes me go Southern. I'm sorry. Because they do what I do when I write. They write out what is supposed to be the accent. Which makes me think that, there's, again, not a whole lot of difference between the accent of Southerners and people from the country in England. "Ta spirits," said Mrs. Hall. "I know ta spirits. I've read in papers of an tables and chairs leaping and dancing." "Take a drop more, Janny," said Hall. "'Twill steady ye." "Lock him out," said Mrs. Hall. "Don't let him come in again. I half guessed. I might have known, with them googling eyes and bandaged head, and never going to church of a Sunday, and all they bottles, more'n it's right for anyone to have. He's put the spirits into the furniture. My good old furniture! 'Twas in that very chair my poor dear mother used to sit when I was a little girl. I think it should rise up against me now." "Just a drop more, Janny," said Miss Hall. "Your nerves is all upset." So yes, I'm assuming that it's alcohol. They sent Millie across the street through the golden 5 o'clock sunrise to rouse up Mr. Sandy Wadgers, the blacksmith. Waggers? Mr. Hall's compliments, and the furniture upstairs was behaving most extraordinary. Would Mr. Waggers come round? He was a knowing man, and Mr. Waggers was very resourceful. He took quite a grave view of the case. "I'm darned if that ain't witchcraft," was the view of Mr. Sandy Waggers. "You warn't horseshoes for such gentry as he." He came round greatly concerned. They wanted him to lead the way upstairs to the room, but he didn't seem to be in any hurry. He preferred to talk in the passage. Over the way, Huckster's apprentice came out and began taking down the shutters of the tobacco window. He was called over to join the discussion. Mr. Huckster naturally followed over in the course of a few minutes. The Anglo-Saxon genius for parliamentary government asserted itself. There was a great deal of talk and no decisive action. Pretty sure that's any government. "Let's have the facts first," insisted Mr. Mr. Sandy Wadgers. "Let's be sure we'd be acting perfectly right and bustin' that there door open. A door on bust is always open to bustin', but ye can't unbust a door once you've busted it." And suddenly, and most wonderfully, the door of the room upstairs opened of its own accord, and as they looked up in amazement, they saw descending the stairs the muffled figure of the stranger, staring more blackly and blankly than ever with those unreasonably large blue glass eyes of his. He came down stiffly and slowly, staring all the time. He walked across the passage, staring, then stopped. "Look there," he said, and their eyes followed the direction of his gloved finger, and saw a bottle of sarsaparilla hard by the cellar door. Then he entered the parlor, and suddenly, swiftly, viciously slammed the door in their faces. Not a word was spoken until the last echoes of the slam had died away. They stared at one another. "Well, if that don't lick everything," said Mr. Wadgers, and left the alternative unsaid. "I'd go in and ask about it," said Wagner's to Mr. Hall. "I'd demand an explanation." It took some time to bring the landlady's husband up to that pitch. At last he rapped, opened the door, and got as far as, "Excuse me." "Go to the devil," said the stranger in a tremendous voice, "and shut that door after you." So that brief interview it terminated. Chapter 7. The Unveiling of the Stranger. Ooh, are they finally going to get a name, or are they just going to be like, "Yep, nope, he's legit invisible"? Let's find out. The stranger went into the little parlor of the Coach and Horses about 5:30 in the morning, and there he remained till near midday, the blinds down, the doors shut, and none, after Hall's repulse, venturing near him. All that time he must have fasted. Thrice he rang his bell, the third time furiously and continuously, but no one answered him. "Him and his go to the devil indeed," said Mrs. Hall presently. Presently came an imperfect rumor of the burglary at the vicarage, and two were put together. Hall, assisted by Wadgers, went off to find Mr. Shuckleforth, the magistrate. Really? Shuckleforth? And take his advice. No one ventured upstairs. How the stranger occupied himself is unknown. Now and then he would stride violently up and down, and twice came an outburst of curses, a tearing of paper, and a violent smashing of bottles. The little group of scared but curious people increased. Mrs. Huckster came over. Some gay young fellows resplendent in black ready-made jackets and peak paper ties, for it was Whit Monday. I really need to Google what Whit Monday is. Joined the group with confused interrogations. Young Archie Harker distinguished himself by going up the yard and trying to peep under the window blinds. He could see nothing, but gave reason for supposing that he did, and others of the Ipping youth presently joined him. It was the finest of all possible Whit Mondays, and down the village street stood a row of nearly a dozen booths, a shooting gallery, and on the grass by the forge were 3 yellow and chocolate wagons, and some picturesque strangers of both sexes putting up a coconut shy. Am I supposed to understand any of that? Yellow and chocolate wagons. All right. And a coconut shy. The gentlemen wore blue jerseys, the ladies white aprons, and quite fashionable hats with heavy plumes. Wadger, of the Purple Fawn, and Mr. Yeagers, the cobbler, who also sold old second-hand ordinary bicycles, because those two things go together. Well, I mean, it's easier to ride a bike with good shoes, I suppose. We're stretching a string of Union Jacks and Royal Ensigns, which had originally celebrated the Jubilee, across the road, And inside, in the artificial darkness of the parlor, into which only one thin jet of sunlight penetrated, the stranger, hungry we must suppose, and fearful, hidden in his uncomfortable hot wrappings, poured through his dark glasses upon his paper, or chinked his dirty little bottles, and occasionally swore savagely at the boys, audible if invisible, outside the windows. In the corner by the fireplace lay the fragments of half a dozen smashed bottles, and a pungent twang of chlorine tainted the air. So much we know from what was heard at the time and from what was subsequently seen in the room. About noon, he suddenly opened his parlor door and stood glaring fixedly at the 3 or 4 people in the bar. "Mrs. Hall," he said. Somebody went sheepishly and called for Mrs. Hall. Mrs. Hall appeared after an interval, a little short of breath, but all the fiercer for that. Hall was still out. She had deliberated over this scene, and she came holding a little tray with an unsettled bill upon it. "Is it your bill you're wanting, sir?" "Why wasn't my breakfast laid? Why haven't you prepared my meals and answered my bell? Do you think I live without eating?" "Why isn't my bill paid?" said Mrs. Hall. "That's what I want to know." "I told you 3 days ago I was waiting a remittance." "I told you 2 days ago I wasn't going to await no remittances." "You can't grumble if your breakfast waits a bit, if my bill's been waiting these 5 days, can you?" The stranger swore briefly but vividly. "Nar, nar," from the bar. "And I thank you kindly, sir, if you'd keep your swearing to yourself, sir," said Mrs. Hall. The stranger stood looking more like an angry diving helmet than ever. It was universally felt in the bar that Mrs. Hall had the better of him. His next words showed as much. "Look here, my good woman," he began. "Don't good woman me," said Mrs. Hall. "I've told you my remittance hasn't come." "Remittance indeed," said Mrs. Hall. "Still, I dare say in my pocket. You told me 3 days ago that you hadn't anything but a sovereign's worth of silver upon you." "Well, I've found some more." "Hullo!" from the bar. "I wonder where you found it," said Mrs. Hall. That seemed to annoy the stranger very much. He stamped his foot. "What do you mean?" he said. "That I wonder where you found it," said Mrs. Hall. "And before I take any bills or get any breakfast or do any such things whatsoever, you got to tell me 1 or 2 things I don't understand, and what nobody don't understand, and what everybody is very anxious to understand. I want to know what you've been doing to my chair upstairs. I want to know how your room was empty and how you got in again. Them as stops in this house comes in by the doors. That's the rule of the house. And that you didn't do, and what I want to know is how you did come in, and I want to know—" Suddenly the stranger raised his gloved hands, clenched, stamped his foot, and said, "Stop!" with such extraordinary violence that he silenced her instantly. "You don't understand," he said, "who I am or what I am. I'll show you. By heaven, I'll show you." Then he put his open palm over his face and withdrew it. The center of his face became a black cavity. "Here," he said. He stepped forward and handed Mrs. Hall something which she, staring at his metamorphosed face, accepted automatically. Then, when she saw what it was, she screamed loudly, dropped it, and staggered back. The nose! It was the stranger's nose, pink and shining, rolled on the floor. Oh, so it wasn't makeup. Then he removed his spectacles, and everyone in the bar gasped. He took off his hat, and with a violent gesture tore at his whiskers and bandages. For a moment they resisted him. A flash of horrible anticipation passed through the bar. "Oh, my God!" said someone. Then off they came. It was worse than anything. Mrs. Hall, standing open-mouthed and horror-struck, shrieked at what she saw, and made for the door of the house. Everyone began to move. They were prepared for scars, disfigurements, tangible horrors. But nothing? The bandages and false hair flew across the passage into the bar, making a hobbledehoy jump to avoid them. Everyone tumbled on everyone else down the steps, for the man who stood there shouting some incoherent explanation was a solid gesticulating figure up to the coat collar of him, and then nothingness. No visible thing at all. People down the village heard shouts and shrieks, and looking up the street saw the coach and horses violently firing out its humanity. That's a fun sentence. They saw Mrs. Hall fall down, and Mr. Teddy Hemfrey jump to avoid tumbling over her, and then they heard the frightful screams of Millie, who emerged suddenly from the kitchen at the noise of the tumult, and came upon the headless stranger from behind. These increased suddenly. Forthwith, everyone all down the street, the sweet stuff seller, coconut shy proprietor. What is a coconut shy? And his assistants, the swing man, little boys and girls, rustic dandies, smart wenches, smocked elders, and apron gypsies began running towards the inn, and in a miraculously short space of time, a crowd of perhaps 40 people, and rapidly increasing, swayed and hooted, and inquired and exclaimed and suggested in front of Mrs. Hall's establishment. Everyone seemed eager to talk at once, and the result was babble. A small group supported Mrs. Hall, who was picked up in a state of collapse. There was a conference and the incredible evidence of a vociferous eyewitness. "Oh, bogey! What's he been doing then? Ain't hurt the girl, has he? Run at him with a knife, I believe." "None, I tell you. I mean no manner of speaking. I mean no marn without a Ed." "Nonsense! 'Tis some conjuring trick. Fetched off his wrapping. He did." In the struggles to see through the open door, the crowd formed itself into a straggling wedge, with the more adventurous apex near the inn. He stood for a moment. I heard the gal scream, and he turned. I saw her skirts whisk, and he went after her. Didn't take 10 seconds. But he comes with a knife in his hand and a loaf. Stood just as if he was staring. Not a moment ago. Went in that there door. I tell 'ee, he ain't got no head at all. You just missed it." There was a disturbance behind, and the speaker stopped to step aside for a little procession that was marching very resolutely towards the house. First, Mr. Hall, very red and determined, then Mr. Bobby Jaffers, the village constable, and then the wary Mr. Wadgers. I noticed the magistrate chuckled something or other was not in that. They had come now, armed with a warrant. People shouted conflicting information of the recent circumstances. "Ed or no Ed," said Jaffers, "I got to rest, and I will." Mr. Hall marched up the steps, marched straight to the door of the parlor, and flung it open. "Constable," he said, "do your duty." Jaffers marched in, Hall next, Wadgers last. They saw in the dim light the headless figure facing them, with a gnawed crust of bread in one gloved hand and a chunk of cheese in the other. "That's him," said Hall. "What the devil's this?" came in a tone of angry exultation from above the collar of the figure. "You're a damned run customer, mister," said Mr. Jaffers. "But Ed or no head, the warrant says body, and duty's duty." I'm sorry. Whether you've got a head or not, the warrant says I need to get your body, so you're coming with me.
Yeah.
Can you imagine being the constable? Coming in, seeing a headless figure eating bread and cheese and being like, "Hey, look, my warrant says body. Head or no head, you're coming with me. Oh boy. Keep off, said the figure, starting back. Abruptly, he whipped down the bread and cheese, and Mr. Hall just grasped the knife on the table in time to save it. Off came the stranger's left glove and was slapped in Jaffer's face. In another moment, Jaffers, cutting short some statement concerning a warrant, had gripped him by the handless wrist and caught his invisible throat. He got a sounding kick on the shin that made him shout, but he kept his grip. Hall sent the knife sliding along the table to Wadgers, who acted as goalkeeper for the offensive, so to speak, and then stepped forward as Jaffers and the stranger swayed and staggered towards him, clutching and hitting him. A chair stood in the way and went aside with a crash as they came down together. "Get the feet," said Jaffers between his teeth. Mr. Hall, endeavoring to act out instructions, received a sounding kick in the ribs that disposed him for a moment, and Mr. Wedger, seeing the decapitated stranger had rolled over and got the upper side of Jaffers, retreated towards the door, knife in hand, and so collided with Mr. Huckster and the City Morton? Carter, coming to the rescue of law and order. I don't feel like I have a small vocabulary, but what the heck is a Sitter Morton? Okay, so I just went through and Googled a bunch of things. 1. Whit Monday. It's the Monday after Pentecostal Sunday. So it marks the, descent of the Holy Spirit upon Jesus' disciples. They'd said that, I would have known what Pentecostal Monday is. I'd never heard of it called Whit Monday. A coconut shy, for those who don't know, is apparently a sideshow or fair game where you throw balls at coconuts bounced on posts. And I can't find an English definition for Sitter Morton except for those coming from the books of H.G. Wells as like a town in one of his other books. So I'm assuming that the Sitter Morton Carter is just a Carter from Sitter Morton. And back to chapter 7. At the same moment, down came 3 or 4 bottles from the chiffonier and shot a web of pungency into the air of the room. "I'll surrender," cried the stranger, though he had Jaffers down, and in another moment he stood up panting, a strange figure, headless and handless, for he had pulled off his right glove now as well as his left. "It's no good," he said, as if sobbing for breath. It was the strangest thing in the world to hear that voice coming as if out of the empty space, but the Sussex peasants are perhaps the most matter-of-fact people under the sun. Jaffers got up also and produced a pair of handcuffs. Then he stared. "I say," said Jaffers, brought up short by the dim realization of the incongruity of the whole business. "Darn it! Can't use them as I can see." The stranger ran his arm down his waistcoat, and as if by a miracle, the buttons to which his empty sleeve pointed became undone. Then he said something about his shin and stooped down. He seemed to be fumbling with his shoes and socks. "Why," said Huckster suddenly, "that's not a man at all. It's just empty clothes. Look! You can see down his collar and the linings of his clothes. I could put my arm—" He extended his hand. It seemed to meet something midair, and he drew it back with a sharp exclamation. "I wish you'd keep your fingers out of my eye," said the aerial voice in a tone of savage expulsion. "The fact is, I'm all here, heads, hands, legs, and all the rest of it, but it happens I'm invisible. It's a confounded nuisance, but I am. That's no reason why I should be poked to pieces by every stupid bumpkin and imping, is it?" The suit of clothes, now all unbuttoned and hanging loosely upon its unseen supports, stood up, arms akimbo. Several of the menfolks had now entered the room, so that it was closely crowded. "Invisible, eh?" said Huckster, ignoring the stranger's abuse. "Who ever heard of the likes of that?" "It's strange, perhaps, but it's not a crime. Why am I assaulted by a policeman in this fashion?" "Ah, that's a different matter," said Jaffers. "No doubt you are a bit difficult to see in this light, but I got a warrant and it's all correct. What I'm after ain't no invisibility. It's burglary. There's a house been broken into and money took." "Well, and circumstances certainly point." "Stuff and nonsense," said the invisible man. "I hope so, sir, but I've got my instructions." "Well," said the stranger, I'll come, but no handcuffs." "It's the regular thing," said Jaffers. "No handcuffs," stipulated the stranger. "Pardon me," said Jaffers. Abruptly, the figure sat down, and before anyone could realize what was being done, the slippers, socks, and trousers had been kicked off under the table. Then he sprang up again and flung off his coat. "Here, stop that!" said Jaffers, suddenly realizing what was happening. He gripped at the waistcoat. It struggled, and the shirt slipped out of it and left it limp and empty in his hand. "Hold him!" said Jaffers loudly. "Once he gets the things off—" "Hold him!" cried everyone, and there was a rush at the fluttering white shirt, which was now all that was visible of the stranger. The shirt sleeve planted a shrewd blow in Hall's face, then stopped his open-armed advance and sent him backward into Old Toothsome and Sexton, and in another moment the garment was lifted up and became convulsed and vacantly flapping about the arms, even as a shirt that is being thrust over a man's head. Jaffers clutched at it, and only helped to pull it off. He was struck in the mouth out of the air, and incontinently threw his truncheon and smote Teddy Henfrey savagely upon the crown of his head. "Look out!" said everybody, fencing at random and hitting at nothing. "Hold him! Shut the door! Don't let him loose! I got something! Here he is!" A perfect babel of noise they made. Everybody, it seemed, was being hit all at once, and Sandy Waggers, knowing as ever as his wits sharpened by a frightful blow in the nose, reopened the door and led the rout. The others, following incontinently, were jammed for a moment in the corner by the doorway. The hitting continued. Phipps, the Unitarian, had a front tooth broken, and Henfrey was injured in the cartilage of his ear. Jaffers was struck under the jaw, and turning, caught at something that intervened between him and Huckster in the melee, and prevented their coming together. He felt a muscular chest, and in another moment the whole mass of struggling, excited men shot out into the crowded hall. "I got him!" shouted Jaffers, choking and reeling through them all, and wrestling with purple face and swelling veins against his unseen enemy. Men staggered right and left as the extraordinary conflict swayed swiftly toward the house door and went spinning down the half-dozen steps of the inn. Jaffers cried in a strangled voice, holding tight nevertheless, and making play with his knee, spun round and fell heavily undermost with his head on the gravel. Only then did his fingers relax. There were cries of "Hold him! Invisible!" and so forth, and a young fellow, a stranger in the place whose name did not come to light, rushed in at once, caught something, missed his hold, and fell over the constable's prostrate body. Halfway across the road a woman screamed as something pushed by her. A dog kicked, apparently. What is that with him and kicking dogs? Stop that. Yelped and ran howling into Huckster's yard, and with that the transit of the invisible man was accomplished. For a space people stood amazed and gesticulating, and then came panic and scattered them abroad the village as a gust scatters dead leaves. But Jaffers lay quite still, face upward and knees bent. Okay. I'm going to be a little uncouth. Not that that's unusual. But could you imagine being a good Christian individual celebrating the Pentecost and then finding out that one of your guests is invisible? I mean, the only reason they didn't think more highly of this situation is because they thought that he had robbed the vicar and had been quite rude to everyone. If he had been a nice person, they would have treated this unveiling of him quite differently. He could have used this to his advantage if he weren't such a ruddy sort. Anyways, Chapter 8, In Transit. The 8th chapter is exceedingly brief and relates that Gibbons, the amateur naturalist of the district, while lying out on the spacious open downs without a soul within a couple of miles of him, as he thought, was almost dozing, heard close to him the sound of a man coughing, sneezing, and then swearing savagely to himself, and, looking, beheld nothing. Yet the voice was indisputable. It continued to swear with that breadth and variety that distinguishes the swearing of a cultivated man. It grew to a climax, diminished again, and died away in the distance, going as it seemed to him in the direction of Aberdeen. It lifted to a spasmodic sneeze and ended. Gibbons had heard nothing of the morning's occurrences, but the phenomenon was so striking and disturbing that his philosophical tranquillity vanished. He got up hastily and hurried down the steepness of the hill towards the village as fast as he could go. Alright, all. I had a fabulous time with this story. I find it quite amusing myself. But that's where we'll end today. I hope you enjoyed it and that my tangents didn't get too rambly. If you liked it, please hit that subscribe button, like it, or review it. You can leave voice messages at anchor.fm/tangents on cracked spines. If you're hearing noises in the background, I apologize. I have a cat going insane. There's a Facebook page called Tangents on Cracked Spines Book Club where you can converse with each other, with me, leave suggestions, vote on the next story to be read, and generally do what Facebook does. You can also visit me personally on Instagram or TikTok at FrankieCore92. I would, do more, but I have a full-time job and I can't handle social media that well. I'm not an old lady, but it seems to. Also, if you would like some merch, my personal Etsy shop, Mama Shaw Designs, that's MAMACHAT Designs on Etsy, all one word, now has merch regarding this Tangents on Cracked Spines. One is just a long sleeve sweater that says Tangents on Cracked Spines with a book on it. There's a t-shirt that says, "Oh look," with a book in front, on the front, and on the back it says "Self-inflicted wound." I have one that says Mary Shelley, mother of sci-fi, with a picture of a bust of Mary Shelley. And I also have a shirt that says Carnivores, not the only monsters, with like a dripping apple clip art with the Frankenstein face superimposed over it because, well, I'm poking fun at the fact that Frankenstein is the monster is canonically vegan in the story. So, if you enjoyed any of this, go check it out, and thank you for listening. That means the most to me, to be perfectly honest. Have a good one, and see you next time.